Hey there, everybody. Welcome to Sabbath School for the Week. I've got a pretty cool guest that we're going to be interviewing this week. The lesson itself, coming out of the quarterly, is actually the second part of a series of lessons in this one. Last week, they were looking at the historical accuracy and relevancy of the Genesis account. And this week, we are also looking specifically again at Genesis, but I've invited a friend, an old professor of mine, Dr. John Reeve from the Seventh-day Adventist Seminary back at Andrews University. He is a professor of church history, and he's going to be kind of talking to us about the history of the interpretation behind Genesis. It's a fascinating discussion, honestly. I think you guys are going to enjoy it because he's definitely well-versed in the area and has already taught a class actually on Genesis just recently, so he's got a few interesting and fun facts for us to kind of dive into. But on top of that, what I really like is the way that he kind of looks at the scope of history, the ways that we have understood Genesis, and how that informs us on through the centuries. We are not the first people, obviously, to read Genesis, and the discussion that we have there, it gets a little bit into some technical areas, looking at some other old manuscripts from the Middle Ages time, and the Renaissance specifically. But what I like that he brings out is that Genesis and the way that Genesis has been understood is very much affected by the historical cultures of the times and the people that were looking at it with their own background. It's a good discussion. I think you guys are going to enjoy it. If you have any questions or interesting thoughts and comments, we would love to see you in Sabbath School tomorrow at 9 a.m. on our Zoom link, which you can always find through the church banner on the website. So hopefully you can get a chance to see that one. If you click on that, it'll take you to our Sabbath School webpage, and there's lots of videos from the past few weeks as well as the present day Zoom link for the Sabbath School at 9 a.m. tomorrow. So hopefully we'll see you there, and I hope you enjoy this discussion with Dr. John. All right, Dr. Reeve, thank you so much for joining us for Sabbath School today. We're going to be looking at some stuff that you've brought up as we were texting a little bit back and forth today, looking at methods of Bible study, specifically in how we've related to our interpretation of Genesis over the years. And that's kind of what the last couple of weeks have been looking at in the Sabbath School Quarterly. So, Dr. Reeve, tell me a little bit about yourself, where you're currently teaching, and kind of some of your research interests.
Okay, thank you, Greg. I appreciate the invitation. I hope that everybody's having a good Sabbath, and I hope you enjoy the Sabbath School discussion. I am teaching at the Seventh-day Adventist Theological Seminary at Andrews University. I teach in the church history department. I also am the director of the PhD and THD programs there, and I do a lot of teaching internationally as well. Currently, I'm the president of the Adventist Theological Society and do a fair bit of traveling until COVID, of course,
Yeah.
having seminars and such around the world. But now I am here in Michigan, have been for the longest time since I moved here 29 years ago. 2.5 months straight.
Good long time. Gotta take those moments where at least you're not like the old pioneers where they had to stop when they got malaria or something.
Yeah, well, we do have to stop when we get COVID, but thank God my heart goes out to those who do. Several of our faculty did get it, but they recovered now. Thank God.
Thank God. Yeah, that's great. I'm glad to hear that.
I'm an early church scholar, which means I spend a lot of my time in the second century, second through fourth centuries. And that's, of course, when most things got started that now exist today in the Christian church. Christianity came of age alongside of Judaism, rabbinic Judaism, in those centuries. And a lot of the tradition of how things are interpreted from the scriptures were worked out during those centuries. A lot of it was worked out well. Some of it was worked out very poorly, which means as Adventists, we have a love-hate relationship with the traditions of the Christian church. We love the fact that we have the resurrected Christ that we are worshiping. We do not like the fact that most of our brothers and sisters worship on Sunday and we worship on Sabbath in response to the commands of God. But there's a million things in between those where we have similarities and some differences.
Yeah, and I think that's one of those interesting details that usually doesn't get brought out. Like you said, the early church, we focus on what they got wrong per se, but we don't always see all the areas that we intersect as well.
Well, about 75% or maybe 85% of what we believe as Seventh-day Adventists, we share with the tradition of the Christian church. The part we do not agree on has become our distinctives, and we have concentrated on those, so it makes it look like we have a lot more discontinuity than we have continuity, whereas the opposite is actually true.
Yeah, which is always kind of an interesting place to be. I've seen within Adventism, especially when we're looking at like the stories in the book of Genesis, what are some of the highlights that you've noticed coming out of that history of interpretation? How have we changed maybe from like an early church understanding to the more present day Adventists? Where are some of those intersections that we're kind of hinted at?
Well, the biggest thing is today, and by today I mean recent history, and by recent history as an ancient historian, I mean the last 500 years, of course. So today, the big issue that most people have with the book of Genesis, particularly those first 2 chapters of the book of Genesis, are where do we get enough time out of the 7-day creation to have the kind of physical structures that we end up with, given an understanding of evolution. And so there's never enough time, and everybody's trying to stretch the time and make more and more time, and all kinds of schemas trying to find time for this to happen. The exact opposite was the problem in the early church. You see, in the early church, their perception of how the world was created was that it was instantaneous. The Platonic worldview had them viewing the Timaeus, the dialogue with Timaeus by Socrates, as the world was an instant. It was a timeless creation. It did not take any time. So their problem was, what do we do with all this time that we have in Genesis 1 and 2? There's 7 days there, and we don't need any. We need no time. And so the exact opposite problem that we've had since the Enlightenment is the case in the general interpretation of the creation story in the book of Genesis. Let's see. I think did you?
I got you there. I'm up.
Lose me or? Okay, very good. Sorry about that.
No, that's fine.
Glitches. So did you catch what I said about the fact that the early church, they didn't need any time. In fact, they had a problem with the time. And now our contrast is we have those that are wanting processes that take time to have lots of time. And the book of Genesis stays with 7 days. And so in the early church, the problem was, what do we do with all this time? And currently, the problem is, where do we get enough time out of 7 days?
Right. That's an interesting switch because, yeah, like you're saying, if the Platonic is instantaneous, they needed 7 days, and now we're on the other side. That's a fascinating change on that one. So would you say then that our understanding or our hermeneutic in approaching Genesis right now is largely a reaction to evolutionary theory and less a wrestling with the scriptures as is?
That's a really tough question to answer because it's a worldview kind of question. We live in a scientific age with a great appreciation for science, and in Adventism, our stress on the medical arts and our stress on healthy living, science is on our side. So we love science in many ways. We are people who have medical schools and education throughout the world, 117 tertiary institutions. So you would think that science was our good friend. And we have this tension when it comes to creation. Science wants to have at least 4.5 billion years of life on Earth. And we want, a few thousand years following 7 days of creation. And so the temptation is to look at Genesis either apologetically to say why the difference, or to say, oh no, there really isn't a difference. And that was the temptation of the early church too. The temptation was to say, oh no, there really isn't a difference. You just have to understand the text in this allegorical fashion.
So we went with so the early church, I'm glad you highlighted that, pulls an allegorical model to help it kind of balance out with the scientific worldview. I just got done reading through a history of a text that kind of relates to this early church stance. I don't know if you have any background on this one. It's called On the Nature of Things. And it was put out by, an ancient Roman poet, really, but it kind of highlights an interesting worldview that we would say is an early statement on molecular structure and atomic theory. On the Nature of Things seems to have, not hit a major roadblock or obstacle, but kind of just disappears during the later centuries, and then resurges again in those 1500s, 1600s during the Renaissance. Do we see the change in scientific understanding being mirrored within the Christian worldview then?
Well, let me make a historical comment first.
Please do.
De Rerum Natura is a title that was engaged by at least 6 different ancient authors, including Juvenal, who's an Epicurean philosopher, who is the one who wrote the one that I think you're referring to. And the basic understanding he had there became the beginning point of Christian philosophers after the Enlightenment trying to make sense of an atomic structure of the universe. And so they adopted the terminology and some of the conceptualizations of the Epicurean philosophy that was stated by Juvenal as he popularized in De Rerum Natura the ideas of a material universe with no God, where natural processes take all things and make all things. So in Aristotle's thought, from previous generations, there was a question as to whether Aristotle was a creationist or whether the material world was eternal alongside of God. And you have the same issue in the Platonic philosophical worldviews. You do not know, depending on which portion of Plato's dialogues you're referring to, whether you have an eternal material world that is then shaped by the divine world, the intelligible world, or whether you have a temporal only world that had an instantaneous beginning, as he describes in the Timaeus. So this tension is there in the ancient world. It continues throughout the Middle Ages. The dominance of the church during the Middle Ages made it so that nobody could disagree with the church without fear of death. This is the whole Galileo issue, If you have the sun as the center of the universe, and you're looking at a telescope and being able to demonstrate scientifically that is so, then you're going against what the church has said, and therefore you are a heretic, therefore must be condemned. And of course, Galileo was condemned. He gets saved from being actually killed, but the church figured that they had won this fight against Galileo. They didn't realize that all they had done was make it sure that they had lost face with a whole set of intellectual community that would then go the other direction completely. And that other direction they go is following Juvenal and the Epicurean philosophy. And so our terminology in a material world with a materialistic situation our terminology comes from Juvenal,
Hmm.
who got Epicurus theoretically. I mean, we don't know for sure,
Sure.
but it looks as if he got it from Epicurus. So the Epicurean terminology of atoms and molecules and all of this, it was adopted. And the evolutionary descriptions of processes were adopted. And they became the voice of the new worldview of a materialistic world where there is no God. And now that's what's at tension with Revelation. Revelation says there is a material world, and it was designed and created by God, and it functions in predictable ways because God designed it and created it that way. And the secular society that is wanting to say we don't need God for processes are saying, no, this is all natural processes and it was inevitable and happened this way without God. And so there's where we're at in the tension now. Do we look at the book of Genesis and interpret it according to church tradition, according to later church tradition, according to our own church tradition, or according to a secular worldview that denies God? And I'm not sure that we can actually approach the text in an unbiased way.
Well, and then that brings me to a natural point. Then, is it possible, and if so, what kind of hermeneutic tools, what kind of Bible study tools can we use to get some of our bias out of the way? Because, like you said, I'm not sure it's totally possible either. But at the same time, what can we do to try to uncover some of our bias and get more to the text itself?
That's the $64 question, or 64 question, more like it. But there are good hermeneutical principles that will help. The number one is pay attention to what the text is actually saying in the context in which it was originally said. So contextualizing the message is vitally important. And when we contextualize the book of Genesis, we recognize that many things are in categories that we're not familiar with. They're not our questions that are being answered. They're questions from then that are being answered. And as we try to understand that, and John Walton and others have spent their careers trying to understand that, it helps us to contextualize what answers are. But what John Walton has done is he's gone too far. He's abandoned, in my opinion, the idea that not just contextual information is given, but timeless information is given, or information will work for all times. And so he misses the characteristic that is inherent to the Genesis text of how the author of the book of Genesis, which I take to be Moses, was actually fighting against the worldview of his time, not just contextualizing it, but correcting it. And so seeing the text as correcting misunderstandings, just as a quick example, sun and moon are not named because in most cultures, sun and moon are deities.
Mm-hmm.
And Moses is trying to do here, among many other things, is to declare that that which is made is not deity. That which made was deity. So the creator is separate from, above, and different from his creation, and is always the sovereign. So that's one of the things that is contextually being argued by Moses to correct the misunderstandings of his time.
Okay, interesting. So yeah, assuming a Mosaic authorship, then we have to read it with that background. Moses is looking and saying, here's a prevailing worldview that I need to, in some ways, correct, respond to, use and understand within that cultural mindset whatever avenues I have to shift it towards the real.
And some of it doesn't even matter if you don't go with the Mosaic authorship, because clearly the authorship is definitely before 4th or 6th century BC. And so we end up with a contextualization that is so different than our own, whether you put it in the 12th or 14th centuries BC, or whether you take it and put it in the 4th or 6th or 8th centuries BC. That part doesn't change.
Yeah,
so
it still stands out.
That's right. That part is not dependent upon a Mosaic authorship.
Interesting. So as we're approaching this, 21st century, obviously the Genesis narrative is a lot on the church's mind, especially in Adventism, but it's on the greater like evangelical mindset ever since the early 20th century. What is our way forward in your mind in looking at Genesis historically, hermeneutically? What's our best way forward in not throwing out our scientific community, but still maintaining a high view of Scripture that tries its best to understand it with as much background as possible?
Well, here's where I'm going to be more of a historian than a systematic theologian.
Okay.
Because I don't have to end up with an absolutely logical system, even though I do recognize that is our goal. That's what we all want. That's what we're striving for. But from my perspective, that's not my part of the project. My part of the project is to poke holes in everybody else's system when they've claimed they've achieved it and haven't. And ultimately, what has happened is a large percentage of the American evangelical world has followed a Calvinistic totalitarianism where you end up with a religious part and a science part that are totally separated. And you say, well, no, that's Kant. Yes, it's Kant, but it's Kant building on a Calvinistic perception, conceptualization. And the problem I have with the Calvinist perception there is twofold. One, Calvin knows more than we can know. When he ends up making a system that is based on the sovereignty of God, I appreciate that. I appreciate the sovereignty of God. But it's not the only thing that has to be taken into account in order to make his system logical. And that is the only thing he thoroughly takes into account. So he does not end up with a fluid or flexible system. He ends up with a system where he says, since we know this system, we know absolute truth and can act on it. And I will never be that comfortable with human absolute theology. We have to act, but we cannot act as if we're absolutely correct, because we will never be able to assert that we are absolutely correct, which means we have to have a little methodological self-doubt, if I may say there. Do not want to trust myself so much that not only am I willing to die for my faith, but I'm willing to kill for it. And that's the line that Calvin crossed. And that's the line, unfortunately, that many Calvinists today are crossing. Not that they're killing people, but they're willing to say, I'm so sure I'm right that I can act in ways that correct other people and shape their lives and their existences. And I don't think we can be that comfortable with our own understanding of truth. And we have a prophet in Adventism that cautions us against such things. Our prophet helps us to know that we do not know things absolutely. We can have confidence in what we know, but it's not absolute knowledge. And she leads us to be willing to question what we understand to be true in such a way that we'd be willing to accept new light when it's necessary. Of course, this has been abused by a lot of Adventists over the years, where they have come up with a new interpretation of something and then say, oh, we're expecting new light, and this is it, everybody has to follow me now. We're not talking about either. But I am talking about being sure enough to act, but not being sure enough to condemn.
That sounds like the sweet spot in both intellectual honesty, but in also biblical authority. Honestly, you're not saying that we have to make everything relativistic, but you're saying we can say what we know, and we have to leave room for what we don't know.
Yes, which means in reading the book of Genesis, I can be quite sure that science has a lot of truth out there. But as a historian, I happen to know that there's a big difference between testable science and historical science. And scientists tiptoe over a line when they suggest that their historical science is of the same validity as their testable science. And that's just not true. So there needs to be a little less surety on both sides on this issue. And there needs to be a little bit of willingness to say, I do not understand it all, but clearly the book of Genesis shows that God created in a short time, not a whole long time ago. Short earth creationism designed by the sovereign God. And yet I do not understand all that I'm seeing in nature. And clearly, nature has fallen. We have to read Genesis 1 and 2 in the light of Genesis 3.
Yeah.
And we will never understand Eden as much as we want to. We are always going to understand the post-fall world, the post-fall ecological systems, much better than we will understand the pre-fall world and the pre-fall ecological systems. That we have to for.
And truly, we have to see the post Noah's flood world. That's really all we've got.
True enough there as well. Now, I have been a firm belief in God's creatorship as expressed historically in Genesis 1 and 2, and in God's flood, where he saved humanity from destroying itself, and still have a great appreciation for science and the processes of science without having either one wipe out the other.
Yeah. Which I think it's the only real place to be if you're going to be honest with both the science and the theology. Dr. Reeve, I want to thank you for that, but I want to give you a chance if there's any final thoughts in relation to this look at how we read and interpret Genesis. What can you see as most beneficial for the church and for people here in Sabbath School as we're looking at these issues surrounding the Genesis account?
I got to say, don't hold on to what you know, hold on to who you know. God is going to see us through in spite of the fact that I have inevitably made mistakes.
Amen to that. Amen to that. Well, thank you, Dr. Reeve. I really appreciate you taking some time with us today. You are doing great work back there at the seminary, getting your steps in today, it looks like, and also surviving all of the pandemic-related stuff. So thank you again for your time today.
Thank you. God bless.
All right, well, that's our Sabbath School for this morning. Like I said, we would love to have you with us during our Zoom Sabbath School tomorrow morning. It's every week at 9 a.m. on the church website. If you want to check it out, the link is just below me here on the screen. Be sure to jump on that one, and there's links to all of our old episodes and our old video interviews with a bunch of different scholars throughout these last few weeks, and the link to the actual Zoom itself. So I hope to see you tomorrow morning. Have a happy Sabbath.